And welcome back to Learning New Testament Greek, and today we're going to start chapter 7, and we're going to talk about syntax. No, I don't mean the tax put on cigarettes, that's syntax. This is syntax. Let's see if I can spell syntax. Syntax. It has to do how words relate to each other. We're going to talk about how sentences are put together, and we're going to take a look at a few examples, except there's a few things we need to talk about first. And I'm going to introduce a few terms and things like that, and some topics we need to discuss concerning syntax, how words relate to each other. First thing we're going to talk about is something called the kernel clause. Kernel clause. The kernel clause is the most basic form of the sentence. You know how a popcorn's formed by having a kernel that pops into something bigger. It's sort of like a sentence. A sentence has a kernel clause, and everything around it modifies the kernel clause. Let's see an example. John, the captain of the football team, threw the ball to George, the wide receiver. Alright, that's a huge sentence, but the kernel clause is John threw. That's the most important part of the sentence. That's the kernel, and everything else modifies the sentence John threw. Well, who's John? Well, he's the captain of the football team. Well, what did he throw? Well, he threw a ball. Well, where did he throw the ball? Well, he threw the ball to was George, and George was the wide receiver. But the kernel clause is the main subject and the main verb. And from everything else in that sentence modifies somehow the kernel clause. And it's a good way to, or a good thing to keep in mind, because whenever you're going to be working in Greek, always look for the kernel clause. And from then you can say, oh, this is the most basic form of the sentence. Everything else in this sentence is going to modify this kernel clause. And it sort of helps put it into chunks that we can work on. We'll look more into the kernel clause and how it interacts and things like that once we start getting into examples. But I wanted to talk about a few other things before we get there. Kernel clause is one, and the subject. The subject. The subject of the sentence is what the sentence is about. In our example, John was the subject. The sentence was about John. The subject is the star of the show, and in Greek it's typically going to be on a word in the nominative case. It could be a noun or a participle or an adjective acting like a noun, a substantival or substantival use of the adjective. But don't worry, we'll get all that later. Right now, subjects are going to be nominative nouns for the most part. Even though there are a few cases where you can have a prepositional phrase working as a subject, but we'll get to that much later. Typically, most of the time, your subject is going to be on a noun in the nominative case. Almost all the time, but not always. There are a few exceptions, and we'll get to those once we get there. So when you're going to look for your kernel clause, the first thing you have to do is to look for your subject and your verb. Now, it might be easier to find your verb first, then find the subject, but those are the two important things, is to find the main verb and the main subject. In fact, later on, I believe we're going to actually start off looking for verbs, and because the verb will help us figure out what the subject is, but we'll get to that probably next time. But you're saying, well, how can a subject, or how can a verb help us figure out what the subject is? Don't we need to know the subject before we know the verb? Well, that brings us to the idea of agreement. I'm going to change colors and write agreement over here. Agreement. Certain words must agree with each other. It's not that they're having an argument, but when I mean agree, let's see. I guess I'll give you an example. Subjects must agree with their verbs in two ways. Person and number. Hey, that didn't go off the page. All right. So, subjects agree with their verbs in person and number. For example, let's see. Do I want let's see. We're going to do an English example for this. A subject agreeing a person and number with its verb. I is. I is something. Well, that doesn't agree in person because I is a first person and is a third person verb. That's a first person pronoun. So this does not agree in person. So it is cannot be the verb of I. This applies the same way in Greek. If you have a subject in Greek, it's going to represent a subject, and that's going to represent a verb, and they don't agree in person and number, then this verb cannot be that related to that noun, or this noun cannot be the subject of that verb. So that's what I mean when I say that finding the verb first will help us find the subject. Is you might have a couple nominatives in the sentence, but your verb will agree with the nominative that is the subject. And there are cases it might agree with others, but we'll get there and we'll look at those. And context will help us out a good deal. Hopefully I haven't confused you with this, but subjects and verbs must agree in person and number. That's why we don't say, you am, because you am, that's not good English, because you have a disagreement in person and number. John are going to school. Well, are going isn't the right person number for the subject John, and the same principles apply in Greek. So your subject and verb must agree in person and number. Something a little more foreign is the article and its noun must agree in gender, number, and case. Gender, number, and case. For example, if I had the word doulos, and I wanted to make it articular, that is, I wanted to put an article on it, I'd have to use a article that agrees in gender, agrees or has the same gender, number, and case as doulos. Doulos is what, a masculine singular nominative, so I'd need a masculine singular nominative article, which is ha. Ha. Let's see. Ha. There we go. I'll get the breathing mark right eventually. Ha doulos. The slave. And I know it's the slave. This article agrees with this, doulos, because they have the same gender, number, and case. I can't say to doulos. Or if you see this, you know this article can't be modifying this word because they don't agree or have the same gender, number, or case. Actually, they might have the same gender, and though they do have the same gender and number, but they don't have the same case, so they can't agree. Or they don't agree, so they can't be modifying this doulos. Right? Okay. Oh, well, I can't move on because there's something particular, idiomatic, if you will. The idiomatic means peculiar to a language. We have idioms in English, usually terms like raining cats and dogs is an idiom in English. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense, but English speakers know it. There's an idiomatic construction in Greek, or that has to do with agreement, that you'll see, and it's going to throw you off the first few times you see it, and you're going to say, what on earth is going on here? And you're going to have to go look it up 4 or 5 times. But eventually you're going to remember it, and you're going to say, oh, I remember that. So don't worry if you have to look it up 20 or 30 times. In fact, I encourage you to, because when you look something up, you're learning. All right. It's an odd idiosyncratic construction, but neuter plural nouns will often take singular verbs. Even though they don't agree in person and number, they still do it. So neuter plural nouns will often take singular verbs as their verb. Let's see. A neuter plural noun. What's a neuter plural noun? Let's see. Let's say techna. Techna from technos, meaning child. So children, and it's going to take a singular verb. Eke, because it's children, third person. So children have. You would normally see it. Well, let's see, what are our verbs? O, es, a, amen, eta, usi. So we would expect ek, usi, or ek, usin, remember your movable nu. Pardon me. Tekna eke, you'd usually expect tekna ekusin, but neuter plural nouns will often take singular verbs. So this would be correct. Pardon me one moment. Okay. I'm getting over a cold, so sorry about the coughing and odd-sounding voice. But don't worry, you don't have to put up for me much longer, because we're going to talk about word order, then we're going to call it a day. Word order. Except that looks like low. Word order. Word order. Now in English, you must have a particular word order, because we help determine meaning. Our syntax is based on word order. Greek syntax is based on case endings, or endings of words and things of that nature, so they don't rely on word order as much as we do. For if wrong word order you use, sound like sage puppet you will. But in Greek, it's fine because they use cases. Now, typically, there is a basic structure. I believe they like to put the verb first, usually, then a noun, and so on and so forth. But for the most part, Greek grammar doesn't rely on word order. There are a few cases word order is important, a few structures that it's important in, but for the most part, it doesn't really matter, or it's up to what the author wanted to do. Oftentimes, they would put something important, the most important thing they wanted to talk about, or the important point of the sentence, I'll put it first. Can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but we will come across those, and we'll point those out when we see them. So word order isn't terribly important. Well, it is important, but it isn't the primary thing. While in English, word order is primary in our understanding of syntax. In Greek, it's the endings that are primary in understanding of syntax. So I could say tekna eke, or I could say eke. That's supposed to be a kappa. I knew that looked wrong. Tekna. And either one would mean children have. Children have and children have. Because of the endings determine the meaning. Now, we swap them around for our English because our syntax requires a certain word order. So hopefully I haven't confused you about that, but don't worry about the Greek word order. Do worry about your English word order. You're going to sound like a unlearned person. All right. So we talked about the kernel clause, which is the most basic form of the sentence, or the most basic elements of the sentence, the main subject and the main verb. And we talked about agreement. Subjects and verbs agree in person and number. Articles and noun agree in gender, number, and case. And neuter plural nouns will often take singular verbs. There are other things of it that agree with each other, but we'll talk about those as we get to them. For example, we'll talk about adjective agreement once we get to adjectives and things of that nature. And participles. Participles, they have a sort of their own set of agreement rules. We'll talk about those once we get to participles, but I believe that's in Unit 3, so you have a good ways to go before then, so don't worry about that yet. And we also talked about word order. So the Greeks didn't depend upon word order for their basis of syntax, they depended upon endings. So word order was important, but it wasn't the primary factor. Alright. So go ahead and read up in the book and see if you can't understand these a little better. And I will see you next time. We'll actually take a sentence apart and look at it and look at the syntax of a Greek sentence next time. Alright, and I'll catch y'all later.